juicy and delicious. And he says, after 9 years, do you know what I've realized? And you remember the next words? He says, ignorance is bliss. Right? He doesn't care. He doesn't want this truth anymore. He doesn't want that difficult life. He just wants to take it easy. Yeah. And he asks, if you remember, as an aside, he asks to become, when he's put back into the Matrix, he asks to become a Hollywood star. He wants to be in Hollywood. And that's also a perfect little point to talk about, because Hollywood is part of that system. It's part of this system that's keeping the world mentally enslaved. Right? Think about the average person. What do we mean when we say mental slavery? They're in a system where their mind is always being directed by the mainstream media, by Hollywood, by music. It's constant imagery, constant information being put into their minds. They're scrolling through Facebook, they're watching movies, it's Netflix, it's the same. It's just what is the average person's life? It's entertainment and food. That's the constant, keeping people happy, subdued, docile. Just feed them, give them physical pleasures, whatever physical pleasures they want. Keep their mind occupied with movies, with music, with sports, with all kinds of nonsense, with news, an endless stream of bad news constantly over and over again, keeping people afraid. There's always some kind of enemy. There's always somebody out there against you. It's always creating false dichotomies. It's liberals versus conservatives, Republicans versus Democrats, black versus white. There's always an enemy out there. Everybody's trying to kill you. The terrorists are trying to kill you. The virus is trying to kill you. Everybody, it's constant from the media, from nonstop, right, into your mind, to keep your mind occupied and distracted, and to keep you just consuming, and to keep you passive and docile. That's the slavery. That's the slave reality that we are in. And Cypher represents that side that says, that's what I want. Let me do that. Let me just sit and watch my shows and eat my popcorn and just have my ice cream and forget about truth. And who cares about all that? I mean, just live my oblivious life.
This is a theater where you're making it up as you go, and as you see how the audience reacts, you change the story, and you evolve the story, and you create the story. This is a theater production. But the important thing to understand about that theater is that in this case, I'm seeing something I've never seen before. And that is when they do this kind of theater, and when I say they, I mean the intelligence agencies. When they engineer a theater like this, they always, they like to mock the crowd. I have never seen the mockery this extreme. This is different. This is new. It's a joke. It's a joke that you would say, we have a manifesto, but it disappeared, but we know it existed and we think we might be able to get it. It's like, what are you talking? I mean, no experienced enforcement person would say that, could possibly say that with a straight face. I mean, it's a mockery, but then, it turns out he's got a roommate, the roommate is trans, they were lovers, but he told his lover, before this, and he did it on this, and and so they keep adding pieces to the story of who the alleged assassin is that make it more and more ridiculous and more ridiculous. And every time, and it's a way of mocking at the audience that they can get them to buy this.
très cher les Européens. Mais à un point, vous n'avez même pas notion de quoi on parle. Et vous n'aurez pas où fuir. Quand l'Italie disparaîtra, quand Édom, c'est pour ça que le QG de la chrétienté qui vient de Esav se trouve là-bas, quand cet endroit-là disparaîtra, et c'est ce que veut faire l'islam, il s'occupe. L'islam, c'est le balai d'Israël, sachez-le. C'est-à-dire que au lieu qu'on fasse tout le travail, et on voit Ishmaël pour régler le problème. Quand il va débarrasser tout ça et que le va revenir chez nous, alors c'est Melech HaMashiach. Cette guerre-là, dans le monde dans lequel on vit, elle est nécessaire. Et pourquoi est-ce qu'elle est nécessaire? Parce que l'un va utiliser l'autre. Pour ne pas qu'Israël rentre en guerre, Akadosh Baruch Hu Shtabach Shemolahad, dit le Chafetz Chaim, va provoquer que Ishmaël se lève contre Esav. Donc ce que vous êtes en train de subir en France, en Europe, qui fait tellement peur, ça devrait être pour nous la plus belle nouvelle de notre histoire juive. Enfin, on commence à s'y approcher. Enfin, on commence à réaliser ce que les sages nous avaient prescrit avant. Ce que je vous ai dit tout à l'heure, c'est marqué dans Sanhedrin. Le Mashiach viendra que quand Édom, l'Europe, la chrétienté sera totalement tombée. Donc je vous pose la question, c'est une bonne nouvelle que l'islam envahisse l'Europe? C'est une excellente nouvelle, ça annonce la venue de Mashiach.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to the Two Cities podcast. It is a great pleasure to be joined once again by my good friend, Mr. Will Tucker. Mr. Tucker, welcome back.
Hello, Theo. Thank you for having me again.
As I'm sure my audience will be aware, Mr. Tucker is the host of the Analogia Entis Substack and YouTube channel, which are platforms that explore the subjects of Jewish messianism, Kabbalah, and Masonry as the principal enemies of the Roman Catholic Church and all mankind. Mr. Tucker has recently been broadcasting a scholarly series that's been focused on ontology, which the Catholic Encyclopedia calls the fundamental science, that all the other parts of philosophy, cosmology, psychology, theodicy, ethics, even logic, rest on the foundation laid by ontology. So you like to grapple with the smaller subjects there. But that's a series that I would commend to our audience today that really, I think, gets right to the roots of the war of the enemies of the church against Christ and against the church's teaching. So tonight we're going to discuss a theme which is becoming more and more prevalent in our world today, and in fact discourse and commentary on it is also following that, and that is the theme, the phenomenon of ritual humiliation. We've talked before about a certain interpretive key that we like to return to, which is that the purpose of a system is what it does. And we have noticed that the contemporary regime, this liberal Judeo-Masonic system, does a lot of ritual humiliation. And there is clearly a purpose behind that. Tacitus said, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. I recently encountered some very interesting passages from Aristotle's Politics, which we're going to go through. But I think just as an example, a mini example, I would like to point to a recent article from the Society of St. Pius X in France, which was called Children Are Being Replaced by Dogs in Spain, that pointed out that in 2023, Spain had approximately 9 million dogs and nearly 6 million cats, compared to 6.6 million children under the age of 14. Dogs even outnumber the 1.8 million children under the age of 4 by 5 times. The Spanish author Jose Morcillo commented on this. He said that this contemporary worship of the dog evinces features of a certain theology that, he says, quote, as in the case of the French revolutionaries, ends in the grotesque and ridiculous, revealing that the enemies of Spain do not only seek its ruin, plunder, and subjugation, but also humiliation and ridicule, in which the victims of this cruel revenge enthusiastically participate themselves, end quote. So the phenomenon of the ritual humiliation is something that I think gets discussed quite widely, let's say within conspiracy circles. What comes to mind for you immediately, Mr. Tucker, when We look at the general discourse, conspiracy discourse on ritual humiliations, some of the contemporary examples.
Well, first of all, would be the Jeffrey Epstein ongoing saga. And I think this fits into another uh, theme that we've explored many times of the reveal conceal dialectic, in which, within political kayfabe, in which the audience is believing and disbelieving at the same time. And we get these leaks, these little, like recently, the emails, the supposed emails implicating Donald Trump and sordid acts, as a way of showing us that our elected authorities are not really in control, but at the same time, we don't fully believe, like, the potential for these things to be fabricated is always there. And so there's a kind of magical working going on, which testing the limits of our ability to comprehend reality, and that's sort of a prerequisite of the so-called democratic processes that we all have a kind of consensus of, like, what the political landscape is. So, yeah, I would say the Jeffrey Epstein, just this continuous drag of details and controversies and evidence that can be disputed, but there's never really a full sort of litigation of who's responsible and why. And so that comes to mind. And then also, I'm in America, so the Black entertainment industry, and particularly rappers and Black athletes, tend to be the victims of a kind of humiliation ritual of feminizing, making them wear dresses and things like that to Met galas. And there's a particular sports gambling mogul, I think his name is Michael Rubin, who throws these white parties similar to the Diddy parties that were recently exposed, in which he has some of the, like, most hardcore violent rappers perform various types of feminizing humiliation rituals, bouncing around like bunny rabbits, dressing up like women, things like that. And so this is something that's widely discussed within, people who have their eyes on that kind of space. Yeah, those are some of the immediate things that come to mind. And I think also with, like, the sports gambling, there's a kind of revelation there, which, people put so much, not just, money, but also time and interest into the sports spectacle, and the capacity for rigging now that causes us to believe and disbelieve the spectacle at the same time, where you think, okay, if this guy has so much power that he can make, the biggest name celebrities who are supposed to be tough guys appear as if they're putty in his hand, then what can they do to the actual event itself? And what are we really watching, and what are we betting on here? So those are some of the immediate things that I think of.
Yeah, the metaphor and the correlation with professional sports spectacles, I think, is apt. We've talked before about political kayfabe, and this is, I think, an element that we didn't discuss, at least at length, which is that the organizers of the kayfabe, the orchestrators, are very much humiliating the audience, the marks themselves. That is inherent to kayfabe. So I think political humiliation rituals, or humiliation rituals in general, one of those things that when you notice, you see how prevalent they are. It's almost humiliation rituals all the way down. When you really look at the way that the regime political spectacle is presented to the masses. I can think of all sorts of examples, the way in which we're going to come onto these in more detail later on, for example, immigration. But when there is a clear public desire for policy to go in one direction, and then the system kind of gums up the process for years and years and years until the policy goes nowhere and the oligarchs get what they want. For example, the Iraq War inquiry in this country, I think it took about sort of 15 years to report, by which it's just like, well, move on now. But by that point, the new emergency of COVID or something comes along, and they're currently doing that now with the rape gangs, the Muslim rape gangs in this country. It gets gummed up, these kind of endless inquiries for years and years and years. Of course, it happens in America, very litigious society that you've got there. And that's all to, I think, intentional to really humiliate the public and to reveal to them in a kind of concealed way that they are in this oligarchy, not a democracy. And that is something that the oligarchs themselves are going to remind them of and demean them as they do so and show them that lesson. It's also intensifying. So a recent major public event which threw up all sorts of doubts about the official narratives very quickly for all their contradictions and incoherences was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I think this event and the way that the Trump administration has responded to it and official media, the narratives that have been given have so many absurdities and contradictions that there does seem to be an intentional degradation of the audience that's been given.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the phrases that really stuck out from that event or psyop, however we're thinking of it, is some of the engravings on the bullets. This gun that's always appearing and disappearing like a rabbit in a hat. Where we have the footage that's leaked of the supposed assassin sprinting across a rooftop, yet from the same camera angle, you could see the actual shooting perch. But that part of the clip was left off, and then you see him sort of jumping off, holding some sort of floppy object, apparently a towel, that deforms, and we're supposed to believe that there's I forget what was the style of gun that it was at this point, this rifle underneath, that bends in half and distorts in every direction as he falls to the ground. He picks back up and then runs away. And it's almost like this magic act, which the towel signifies something that's not really there, like it's all cape and no rabbit. And then this gun that the police quickly identified that's hidden in the bushes, but he intended to come back and get. And we get this text message stream revealing that he's waiting around to try to recover the gun, in which he basically just reveals his entire plot in text messages, even though he's supposed to be a very high IQ person. And engraved on the gun are these messages, this kind of Twilight language that seems devised for public consumption, like notices bulges, for instance. I think that really jumped out to me along the lines of our controlled noticing metaphor that we've played around with. And the bulge kind of signals this thing that's beneath the surface, but eroticizes it in a way, like the torches of freedom from I'm forgetting the name of the early 20th century nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Edward Bernays.
Edward Bernays, yes. Like the torches of freedom, this kind of psychosexual programming going on around that language. And then this thing that's sort of disappearing and evaporating beneath the surface of this, dorm room towel and all the sort of disgusting significations that brings with it. And then, like, if you're reading this, you're gay. What were the other messages on there? Some anti-fascist song. I forget all of them. And then just the supposed it was almost like an Arthurian romance, Lance Twigs, where there's a kind of what's the word? Neutering. The way the phallic symbol there is sort of played around with and then neutered at the same time. Obviously, with this transgender person who then since has disappeared and no one knows where they are, and we don't ever get an interview or anything with them. And like you said, the can is kicked down the road, and there's this sort of controlled amnesia over these things, but at the same time, the trauma still remains behind. Also, I think like the optics around Erica Kirk, obviously very troubling. This memorial, this sort of WWE style memorial service with fireworks. I think the only time that she's wore black after the assassination were the black leather pants that she was wearing when she frisks the vice president, and these bizarre sort of erotic hugs and caresses that she's given to both the president and the vice president at this point. If any man could replace my husband, it would be vice president. The vice president, and then these bizarre rings and Masonic symbolism and hand gestures and stuff that surely, if they weren't trying to instigate conspiracy theorizing, some PR team would have coached them to not make the devil horns hand gesture at that event, right? Amidst fireworks and then this excess of eye makeup. It's almost like the black towel. It reminds me of Tammy Faye Baker, the 1980s televangelist in America, who's constantly has this eye makeup that's just streaming with tears, and it's almost like they pile on more eye makeup just to enhance the tears. But here it's they're concealing the lack of tears. It's like more eye makeup with zero tears. The same way the gun is supposed to conceal something that's not there. It's like all cape and no rabbit. Anyway, I could go on with all these different symbols for days, but there's just so many. Or then, again, the in the immediate aftermath, Kash Patel, who I guess was appointed for the sole purpose of he was going to expose the Epstein files, right? Or at least that's how he came to be publicly known. And then he tweets out, like they're so careful about what evidence they're going to release and why they wouldn't release this portion of the footage, why we only get stills of the assassin like walking up the staircase with the gun, supposedly the noticing bulges, the gun supposedly in his trousers. But he's not hesitant to go out and say, we got him in the immediate aftermath when they arrested this crisis actor, Ashkenazi George Zinn. And then we have the dancing Israeli again, this young man who stands up in the immediate aftermath and starts celebrating and cheering and chanting USA. So we have this sort of Discordian, Kerry Thornley-esque kayfabing going on of misdirection in the immediate aftermath, which would seem to reveal some kind of conspiracy or plot, or a series of plots overlapping on top of each other. And then the Merkel rhombus, it's called, the hand gesture that both Elon Musk and Donald Trump, who haven't spoken and had this very public falling out, flashed together in unison from the penthouse of the Charlie Kirk memorial service. And then that's the same hand signal that's on the Snake Eyes film, which kind of has the date of Charlie Kirkland being assassinated. I mean, there's just so many of these overlapping things that they start to erode the limits of what's possible. And I think that's kind of the point, is to get us into this state in which reality is ultimately collapsed, and we can only refer back to the spectacle itself as the only referent.
Yeah, it's the hyper reality and the way in which John Baudrillard, as you've pointed out, looks to attack the sacramental economy, the let's say the enemies of the church, attack the sacramental economy to the point that it becomes its own referent, as you say, it's self-referential. And I think historically, you mentioned Edward Bernays, the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, with the advance of the revolution, saw a focus on social engineering by the enemies of the church. But from the Second World War onwards, particularly from the 1960s, I think that's obviously continued. It continues right now, but it's been deepened with sort of psycho-spiritual engineering. As you say, the ritual humiliation performs this function of learned helplessness, that you can get energized, get galvanized, vote for Trump, be very much enthused about specific policies, and they will not be delivered. And that's teaching you a kind of lesson politically about, well, it leads to sort of a political despair, which then further empowers those who have hegemonic political control. The psychosexual dimension is a very important part. We might return a little bit to that later. I think the theme of adultery is very important. But in previous broadcasts with Dr. Jesse Russell a number of years ago, we talked about how popular culture, the controllers of popular culture, have very much disseminated the most sort of grotesque material with a focus on the backside. And if you think about dogs and the backside, these are ancient sort of symbols of humiliation. And there are ancient groups which are carrying out this humiliation of formerly Christian peoples. I've been rereading Aristotle's Politics, and I came across this stunning passage, which I'd like to go through with you, Mr. Tucker, because I think it offers several more interpretive keys to understanding ritual humiliation, particularly at the political level. So it's in Book 5, Chapter 11 of the Politics, in which he's talking about the means of preservation of tyranny. So, of course, his three evil regimes are the tyranny, the rule of one, oligarchy, the rule of a few, and then mob rule or democracy, the rule of many. And of course, our own regime combines all three defective regimes today. It is simultaneously a tyranny, an oligarchy, and a democracy of one of mob rule. So in this section, Aristotle discusses some of the methods of tyrants, and I think this is instructive for our moment. So I'm going to read from Aristotle here and pause for your comments, and I've got a few of my own. So Aristotle writes, quote, "As to tyrannies, they are preserved in two most opposite ways. One of them is the old traditional method in which most tyrants administer their governments. Of such arts, Periander of Corinth is said to have been the great master, and many similar devices may be gathered from the Persians in the administration of their government." So interestingly, tyranny is a despotism which is associated with the East, which is interesting when one considers Babylonian magic and the roots of Kabbalah and the principles therein. Back to Aristotle. "There are also the ancient prescriptions for the preservation of a tyranny, insofar as this is possible, namely that the tyrant should lop off those who are too high. He must put to death men of spirit. He must not allow common meals, clubs, education, and the like. He must be upon his guard against anything which is likely to inspire either courage or confidence among his subjects. He must prohibit literary assemblies or other meetings for discussion, and he must take every means to prevent people from knowing one another, for acquaintance begets mutual confidence." End quote. So there, of course, you can see divide and rule, the way in which modern society is becoming more and more fragmented, and the regimes, they look to accelerate that at every turn. Further, he must compel the inhabitants to appear in public and live at his gates. Then he will know what they are doing. If they are always kept under, they will learn to be humble. In short, he should practice these and the like Persian and barbaric arts, which all have the same object. A tyrant should also endeavour to know what each of his subjects says or does, and should employ spies, like the female detectives at Syracuse, and the eavesdroppers whom Hero was in the habit of sending to any place of resort or meeting, for the fear of informers prevents people from speaking their minds, and if they do, they are more easily found out. So, of course, this is just contemporary cancel culture and internet identification, various other forms of the panopticon that are being built today. "Another art of the tyrant is to sow quarrels among the citizens. Friends should be embroiled with friends, the people with the notables, and the rich with one another. Also, he should impoverish his subjects. He thus provides money for the support of his guards, and the people, having to keep hard at work, are prevented from conspiring. The pyramids of Egypt afford an example of this policy. Also, the offerings of the family of Cypselus and the building of the temple of Olympian Zeus, the Peisistradati, and the great Polycratian monuments at Samos. All those works were alike intended to occupy the people and keep them poor." So we're seeing now continually declining standards of living, continually declining wealth and prosperity among the masses, which coincide with deliberate policies of currency debasement, usury, private creation of the money supply.
Yeah, if you permit me to jump in here for a
Yeah.
second, my friend and who I'm collaborating with on this series recently on Eric Shavara's Analogia Antis in comparison with Hans Urs von Balthasar's theory of the kenosis. My friend J. Philip Johnson, he just released a book called The Invention of Work, which critiques this approach of the Second Vatican Council about empowering the laity without taking on the issue of industrial labor, women being forced into the workforce, and how dehumanizing labor has become in the industrial world, and how and that in itself is a kind of humiliation ritual in which we're being empowered. Meanwhile, we have no time in which to participate. So anyway.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think Mr. Johnson is spot on there. We can notice how Aristotle is pointing out that the focus is on these great works like the pyramids of Egypt. It's not like the pharaohs are getting the Egyptian masses to work on their own little farms by the Nile or something. Another practice of tyrants is to multiply taxes, after the manner of Dionysius at Syracuse, who contrived that within 5 years his subjects should bring into the treasury their whole property. The tyrant is also fond of making war, in order that his subjects may have something to do and be always in want of a leader. So this pretty concise short section of Aristotle's Politics, you can see, is just a playbook for the oligarchs who have been ruling our society for possibly centuries. And whereas the power of a king is preserved by his friends, the characteristic of a tyrant is to distrust his friends, because he knows that all men want to overthrow him, and they above all have the power. Again, the evil practices of the last and worst forms of democracy are all found in tyrannies. Such are the power given to women in their families, in the hope that they will inform against their husbands, and the license which is allowed to slaves in order that they might betray their masters. For slaves and women do not conspire against tyrants, and they are of course friendly to tyrannies and also to democracies, since under them they have a good time. Wow. It's so penetrating. We'll come on to this later, the killing of the king ritual, but let's just say that that ritual takes place on many levels. We saw the overthrow of Christian monarchies as one of the essential stages of the Judeo-Masonic revolution. It's been followed, particularly in the 20th century, by the degradation of the father of the family, the destruction of patriarchy, the purposeful destruction of patriarchy, which is a great humiliation to men, to have that dignity taken away from them.
Yeah, it's a decapitation by humiliation of proper authority. And there's this limit, I think, between tyranny and authority. There's like a kind of shadow side to a lot of these distinctions that I think we have to make between, like, for instance, like theosophy and theology, which I might get to later, where there's a distinction between creator and creature, and like a proper authority reflects the authority of God, where a tyranny, is it's a bizarre paradox in which it tries to elevate the creature to the status of God, but in so doing it has to humiliate the creature to a kind of depraved state. Like the Rene Girard condition of mimetic desire and the scapegoat mechanism sort of presupposes this sort of everyone's their own tyrant, and like a status of like kind of absolute depravity without like natural law. But there's I think it's a subtle thing to sort of trace out how, like, penance, for instance, how do we differentiate the concept of penance, the sacrament of penance, from the humiliation ritual? I think we began this thread of thinking along lines of thinking of the humiliation ritual as a form of an inverted kind of anti-sacramental economy, or an anti-sacrament. And likewise, you read the same thing with the authority versus tyranny there.
Yes, if the synagogue, as the elder brother of the church, also has its own sort of anti-sacraments, I think seeing the humiliation ritual as an anti-sacrament is one way of certainly of understanding it. Aristotle writes, quote, "For the people too would fain be a monarch, and therefore by them, as well as by the tyrant, the flatterer is held in honor. In democracies, he is the demagogue, and the tyrant also has his humble companions who flatter him," end quote. So I think that that corresponds slightly to what you were saying there, that there's a kind of paradox that actually in a tyranny, the tyrant flatters the masses while also degrading them.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something we have in our so-called liberal democracies, that there is a great sort of exaltation of human rights and the dignity of all these different groups within the regime, but then we're all degraded and humiliated by the oligarchs in particular ways. And women, for example, they are empowered and exalted by the power structure all the time. But then they are actually humiliated to a massive degree, possibly more than men, actually, in the things that they are encouraged to wear. Just to start with that, and the way that their motherhood is scorned, and the way their femininity is scorned. These are all great humiliations and degradations of women.
Yeah, and how sexualization now, like the different stages of feminism, in which there's like a kind of anti-pornography stage, and now there's a pro women empowerment pornography OnlyFans stage. And it's similar. It was funny what you're saying. There were slaves and women. You see like the black entertainment industry, which in the early '90s, whenever I was a kid, you had gangster rap as like a kind of symbolic form of negative freedom and masculinity, and rebellion has now become the negation of the negation, where now they're wearing dresses and giving like uh, being effeminized, and it's become and that's viewed as a kind of empowerment in which they've allowed themselves to sort of transgress gender normativity or something like that. And yeah, it's just like a but then at the same time, the money rolls in, and that's the precondition of it. So
The particular humiliations visited upon black people and African Americans is distinct,
mhm.
and
Under the banner of civil rights and
yeah,
anti-slavery and black empowerment.
yeah, yeah, the models of masculinity, quote unquote, and femininity that are given, which are so destructive. Hence, tyrants are always fond of bad men because they love to be flattered. But no man who has the spirit of a free man in him will demean himself by flattery. Good men love others, but they do not flatter anybody. Moreover, the bad are useful for bad purposes. Nail knocks out nail, as the proverb says. It is characteristic of a tyrant to dislike everyone who has dignity or independence. He wants to be alone in his glory. But anyone who claims a like dignity or asserts his independence encroaches upon his prerogative and is hated by him as an enemy to his power. So I think that this really, I think, corresponds to the mid-level sort of Gentile Masonic functionaries of the power structure, who are these bad men, as you can see with the Epstein client list and the sordid compromat and debasement, which is the political currency of the power structure. And I think, again, it's why homosexuals are such a large part of that sort of mid-administrative tier, because they are natural flatterers. They dissemble, they disguise, they conceal, and they're easy to control. Whereas good men, family men, men who are interested in the preservation of their country, their culture, religion, are dangerous to this oligarchy, and so will not be allowed to ascend in the power structure.
Yeah, exactly. And we can even see this on a level of like the influencer level too, where we have sort of these morally amphibious figures like Andrew Tate, who you've spoken of quite a bit, or I would even put like the ascendancy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is synonymous with sort of the anti-vaccine movement. And then at his like his hearing before he's made the was the food and drug czar, he proclaims that he's the most pro-vaccine person in the room, and then immediately starts championing the what is it, the MMR vaccine once he's in office, and then saying now that Tylenol is the source of autism and in children. So, and his history is obviously one riddled with drug addiction, and divorce and adultery and things like that. So it does seem like these people are sort of groomed and handpicked for that reason through compromat. I mean, that's how compromat works, right?
And enjoying a McDonald's on Air Force One.
Right.
If only every, and that's a kind of mini ritual humiliation. If only they were only as inane as that, but sadly they're obviously much graver. Aristotle, quote, "Another mark of a tyrant is that he likes foreigners better than citizens, and lives with them and invites them to his table. For the one are enemies, but the others enter into no rivalry with him." End quote. We'll talk more about the immigration avalanche later on. I've got some thoughts on that, but this is the replacement level of migration clearly is something that all sort of Western polities, the power structures in all Western polities are just going pedal to the floor on for partly this reason. There is clearly a means by which they can control those populations that's harder for the, let's say, the heritage populations. Such are the notes of the tyrant and the arts by which he preserves his power. There is no wickedness too great for him. All that we have said may be summed up under three heads, which answer to the three aims of the tyrant. These are: 1. The humiliation of his subjects. He knows that a mean-spirited man will not conspire against anybody. 2. The creation of mistrust among men. For a tyrant is not overthrown until men begin to have confidence in one another. And this is the reason why tyrants are at war with the good. They are under the idea that their power is endangered by them, not only because they will not be ruled despotically, but also because they are loyal to one another and to other men, and do not inform against one another or against other men. 3. The tyrant desires that his subjects shall be incapable of action, for no one attempts what is impossible, and they will not attempt to overthrow a tyranny if they are powerless. Under these three heads, the whole policy of a tyrant may be summed up, and to one or other of them, all his ideas may be referred. 1. He sows distrust among his subjects. 2. He takes away their power. 3. He humiliates them. The political functions of humiliation, as fresh insights today as when they were written 2.5 millennia ago. Quite incredible. So I think you've been doing some reading and research, Mr. Tucker, and this relates to some of your recent conversations with Mr. Johnson on ontology with regard to the metaphysics of the ritual humiliation, the occult metaphysics that it uses, that it presupposes. So how would you introduce that?
So we've begun this project of studying a very difficult 20th century Catholic theologian, metaphysician, Eric Shavara, who is known, who's remembered mostly as being the teacher of Hans Urs von Balthasar. So as I began to look into Shavara's work, I started to notice many of these concepts that I've explored unknowingly, like the coincidence of opposites and even Jewish messianism, he's already addressed. And as we began discussing this issue of ritual humiliation, I began thinking about the kenotic mysticism, the theology of kenosis, which has become so prevalent in 20th century church discourse, and how there's really no precedent for it anywhere within the Catholic tradition until Hans Urs von Balthasar appears on the scene in, the mid 20th century, and how this is even sort of, there's a kind of crypto-Balthasarian influence even within traditional Catholic discourse, I think along these lines. And it's kind of a very subtle thing to work out. And in so doing, you have to kind of understand that you have to establish sort of safeguards around the creator-creature divide. And I think once we look at that, we start to begin to understand more about how magic works and why it's forbidden. And then we can look at this fundamental text. I think it began as Balthasar's thesis. It's called The Apocalypse of the German Soul, which traces this genealogy of Germanic mysticism and so the precedents for kenotic theology from Meister Eckhart, who was a contemporary of and a student of St. Albert the Great and a contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas, and kind of introduced this parallel path, this kind of left-hand path to scholastic metaphysics and mysticism, which I would contend is a kind of false mysticism, appears alternatively to that and begins to sort of take hold, particularly in the Renaissance. So we have this genealogy from Meister Eckhart to Nicholas of Cusa, who we've discussed in relation to the coincidence of opposites, and particularly Cusa's other sister concept, which is learned ignorance, which I think is really important for understanding how the humiliation ritual works through sort of ontological warfare, an assault on how intellect, on intellect and will. And then this important text called the Theologia Deutsch. And what's happening is like the apocalypticism of Joachim de Fiore and his followers is being imported into this German mystical strain, in which it becomes an interior apocalypse, a personal revelation. And you can see in that sort of the roots of like the infinite dignity of the person and the personalism of 20th century thinking, but at the same time, a kind of negative theology of canonicism. And then from there, we have Reuchlin and his Christian Kabbalism in the Renaissance, Paracelsian alchemy, and this one really important figure named Jakob Boehme, who I think is incredibly influential in Germany, but also in Russia, Russian sophiology. Much of the thinkers that influenced, like Valentin Tomberg, were influenced by Boehme. Also, the Cambridge Platonist in England. He was very influential for like a lot of the theosophy that was imported into Freemasonry as well. So, the humiliation ritual as a heterodox form of esoteric mystagogy conditions the intellect and will toward divine nothingness. And this nothingness needs to be differentiated from the apophatic unknowing of Dionysus the Areopagite's mystical theology. So I think there's this sort of process of unknowing that's in Dionysus's apophaticism, in which it's a safeguard. It safeguards divine transcendence, where in this German mystical strain of kenoticism, that unknowing of God who is beyond being and non-being, that becomes the divine nothingness that can be claimed, it can be obtained, and it's actually the secret to mystical union. And so there's, I think, a failure I've done in the past of talking about the coincidence of opposites there, because there is a proper way of conceiving this, an orthodox way, in which God, in God, there is a unity of the opposites of like immanence and transcendence, of essence and existence. God is Alpha and Omega. And those are names, but that obviously God exceeds all of those as well. But there's what Nicholas of Cusa introduces is a coincidence of opposites that's based upon privations, where being is the opposite of non-being, or good is the opposite of evil, where those things aren't true opposites, because evil and non-being are a kind of mode. They participate in the good. They're a privation, so they don't have the same sort of ontological substance and value that a positive thing does. So they use this, or they leverage this sort of loophole in ontology as a way to sort of achieve mystical union through divine nothingness, but it has to be achieved through a kind of a menticide, a murder of the mind, as we've called it in the past. But I think it's best understood in this category that Cusa introduces, called learned ignorance. So there's a quote from Pope Pius XII's Mystici Corporis, where he says, "For while there still survives a false rationalism which ridicules anything that transcends and defies the powers of human genius, and which is accompanied by a cognate error, the so-called popular naturalism, which sees and wills to see in the church nothing but a juridical and social union, there's on the other hand a false mysticism creeping in, which in an attempt to eliminate the immovable frontier that separates creatures from their creator." So the immovable frontier here echoes the Fourth Lateran Council's edict: between creator and creature, no similarity can be so great that a greater dissimilarity between them cannot be seen. And I think this is like the primary principle in the analogy entis, that there's a similarity between creator and creature, but it's followed by even greater dissimilarity. That's why it has to remain analogical, and it can't become fully univocal. And the exception of that is what's called the communication of idioms, in which Christ takes on a human nature and enters into sort of pain and suffering. And so we have union with God, a kind of univocal relation to God's, or to Christ's human nature, but not to his divine nature in that sense. But that's a much more complicated can of worms to get into here. So in order to properly comprehend what makes magic, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, and false mysticism forbidden, I think it's first necessary to understand how they violate this creator-creator divide. Theosophy, as opposed to theology, seeks to obtain a God's eye view of reality. It seeks to see things, from God's perspective. So while for Pseudo-Dionysus, the unknowable beyond being and non-being is a limit concept that safeguards divine transcendence, for Eckhart, Cusa, Burma, the idealists, and I will contend von Balthasar, nothingness becomes an obtainable substance hidden within the uncreated soul, uniting him to the primordial abyss that it pre-exists the creator. So
Simsum.
Right. And sort of evolving right alongside this tradition in the same place at the same time is Kabbalah, the Ein Sof, the Zimzum, the Tikkun Olam concepts, which are directly parallel to the kind of mystical theosophy that Eckhart and Cusa and Burma are all and increasingly more explicit. Like in Burma, you finally have it's almost a direct parallel to Lurianic Kabbalah. And so Balthasar won't sort of openly reference Kabbalah, except maybe in that afterword to Meditations on the Tarot, but he won't cite it as like a reference for his theology, but he will Burma. So we can trace a kind of genealogy to the modern kenosis back to this. And then Hegel and Schelling, the German idealism, which, there was this recent conversation between Cardinal Mueller and Bishop Robert Barron. And this is a side note that talked about Hegel and the German idealists and this sort of error of modern Gnosticism, which they define it as a kind of extreme mind-body dualism. And I think what's going on here is more complicated, and there's a polarity at work, this creator-creature polarity. And also you can see that at work between like German idealism, which privileges, the concept, idea, thought over, materialists. Like you have, Hegel is the greatest influence on Marxist, who's a pure materialist, or you could even do idealism versus existentialism,
Coincidence of opposites.
Right. Sorry, I'm getting to how this all adds up into the humiliation ritual, so it's kind of a slow build here. So for St. Thomas, God is immovable and impassible. We are related to him, but he is unrelated to us. And this is the foundation of the analogy entis that prevents it from collapsing into
Sorry, can you imagine what Vatican II would have to say about that statement from St. Thomas that you've just given?
Yeah, I don't have it here, but there's a quote from Lumen Gentium that talks about the kenosis of God, and it's blurry. Like you can see this progression within Vatican II theology or popes, where there's a proper way of talking about the kenosis in the form of the incarnation. It happens in the incarnation side of Christ, and this is something that Jay Johnson and I are going over in this series we're doing. So if you're interested more on this, please check it out. But with John Paul II will always sort of couch his language about the kenosis, even though he's working alongside Hans Urs von Balthasar, in sort of incarnational language. But then when you get to Benedict XVI, it's an kenosis. It's reading the kenosis all the way up into the Godhead, in which God's essence is to constantly be pouring himself out into the Son, who then in turn pours himself out into the Spirit. And so it's like, but then they say, since it's an eternal act, it doesn't cut at divine impassibility. But then I think Balthasar goes even so far to call it super death. So the essence of God is super death. It gets pretty extreme and esoteric.
Yeah, just on that, I recognize that strain in the Divine Mercy devotion in the Diaries of Sister Faustina, in which I think she says that the essence of the Blessed Trinity is mercy, which again is that kind of sort of inner death, or in response to some kind of privation, some kind of defect Whereas the essence of the Trinity is, of course, charity and mercy is a response to our sinfulness. So, as you say, it's sort of reading the kenosis up into the Godhead.
Right. And then Adrian von Speer is so talking about false mysticism. Hans Urs von Balthasar has this very close relationship with this controversial mystic, Adrian von Speer, who's like a twice or thrice divorced former Protestant. Balthasar even goes and lives with her. He leaves the Jesuits to go live with her and form this spiritual community. But he bases a lot of his theology on her mystical visions, in which she has some very judgmental things to say about St. Thomas's prayer life, and then also she claims to see the sort of internal relations of the Trinity. It's some very bold stuff, to say the least. So for the German esoteric tradition of the divine kenosis, God is constantly being poured out into nothingness for the sake of the other. And so this pouring out, it appears as if God is composite, because there had to be something other than God for God to enter into and to void himself into. And so that, again, it cuts at divine impassibility. So the spark of the soul, as Meister Eckhart calls it, contains the same uncreated ground of nothingness that constitutes God. As man empties himself, of his intellect and will, of his rational soul, in what St. Thomas defines as the imago Dei, he enters into union with God, uncovering the spark of the divine. It's likely no coincidence that, as we just said, German kenotic mysticism appears alongside the Kabbalistic ideas of the medieval period. And here we can see the development of the humiliation ritual in what is known as descent theology. So the descent precedes the ascent within German mysticism and also within Kabbalah. So German descent theology can be described as where the soul approaches God through a movement of voluntary descent, self-emptying and unknowing, an inner kenosis that mirrors the kenosis of Christ. Descent theology holds that God descends into creation, into the soul, into flesh, and at the limit into death and nothingness. For descent theology, the way down is the way up. The descent precedes the ascent. And as we've discussed previously in the Jewish Merkabah tradition that foreshadows the Kabbalah, the vision of Ezekiel's chariot becomes the source of a speculation where the mystic can ascend to the mystical throne room of God, where he can obtain secrets. But according to Gershom Scholem, the ascent is actually a descent, in which the mystic descends into a trance state beneath reason, where ontological distinctions are no longer fixed. So a kind of state of learned ignorance. So for Pseudo-Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius descends into darkness because God is beyond being. Master Eckhart descends into darkness because the soul's own ground is beyond being. And this is a concept which we'll see in a second in Eckhart, in which there's a Seelengrund, there's a ground in the soul which is the same as the ground that's within God. And he posits that there's a God, which is the personal God of revelation, and then there's a Godhead, which is a higher God. And you can see how this mirrors the Kabbalistic Sephiroth structure of, you have Ein Sof, and then the Keter or Ein, and then Hakma, Bina, etc. These various sort of descending hypostases. So here's a few quotes from Eckhart. There is something in the soul that is uncreated and uncreatable. If the whole soul were such, it would be uncreated and uncreatable. In this breakthrough, I discover that God and I are one. God is a being beyond being, echoing Dionysus here, a nothingness beyond being and nothingness. In this abyss, the Abgrund, all distinction ceases. So this concept of the Abgrund, the groundless ground it's called, is really important for this mystical tradition, and it foreshadows Balthasar's concept of the infinite distance. So he says there exists within the Godhead an infinite distance between the Father and the Son, in which God is pouring out his essence into the Son across this infinite distance. And within this space is the capacity for evil and sin. Evil and sin and suffering emerges out of this space. And so he's trying to sort of reclaim and inoculate, to use his language, the Catholic theology against sort of the influence of Hegelianism by incorporating these older mystical forms that influenced Hegel. So anyway, moving on, another Eckhart quote: "The ground of the soul and the ground of God are one ground." So the descent into the soul, into the ground of the soul, is where one finds the spark of the divine and enters into a unity via divine nothingness. And then he says, therefore the soul must go down into her own ground, and there she finds God as in his nothingness. And Hegel's favorite quote by Eckhart is, the eye with which God sees me is the eye with which I see him. My eye and his eye are one. By a righteous standard, I am weighed in God, and God in me. If God were not, I would not be. If I were not, then he would not be either. And so you can see this, collapsing of the creator-creature divide, and via a kind of taking apophatic theology and turning it inside out and using it as a kind of paradoxical strain of unlearning ontological boundaries so that we can enter into unity with the divine.
A quotation that I've cited a number of times in our discussions, Mr. Tucker, is that of Sergio Quinzio, that modernity is characterized by the imposition of Jewish categories. There you just said it, the collapsing of the creator-creature distinction. If you think about Talmudic parables like the oven of Achnai, which is all about that sort of deification of the Sanhedrin, of the rabbinic sages. What I appreciate particularly about your scholarship here is how you help us to grasp these pretty complex concepts. And it strikes me, actually, just going back to what you were saying about personalism, which is really the sort of anthropological core, you might say, of modernism. And by the way, following what St. Pius X said about modernism being the synthesis of all heresies, you can see here all these currents going into it, how that's entirely true. And but personalism, it's marked by this eagerness to sort of appropriate the language, the categories, the policies of liberalism. And just as you've been sort of studying the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism and these topics quite intently, I've been studying liberalism, as you know, and the more one studies liberalism, the more one realizes how much of an abyss and how much of a vacuum it is, which is, I think, what you're saying about how it's characterized by this negative freedom, that the only rule on the freedom of the individual is freedom itself. So it has that circular logic and that self-referentiality. And I think there it just shows how all these ideas are all these occult ideas, ultimately, they're all connected in their false ontology, their false metaphysics, which you're laying out here.
Yes, this Abgrund concept, or what Jakob Burma translates to the Ungrund, this sort of primordial ground of the Godhead, is defined as a kind of abyss of freedom, which is also like an abyss of love. But love is defined as a kind of negative freedom, an abyssal freedom. So that I forget which psalm it's from, but it translates in Latin to like the abyss calls unto the abyss, which, read properly is sort of like Augustine's, God-sized whole principle, and that like the abyss in the human heart calls unto the limitless, unknowable essence of God, and it can only be filled by that. What they radicalize that concept in which, no, God is an abyss and there's an abyss in my soul. And by decreating myself and deconstructing myself and putting myself through this sort of uncharitable, unpenitent humiliation ritual, and denying the Imago Dei, I descend into the depths of the hidden spark within myself, and there I discover the divine. So Schelling, Friedrich Schelling, first claims that freedom precedes being. So God in his purest ontological state is pure freedom, pure potency, which again here it echoes the Ein Sof over and over again. So it's
even though of course he doesn't have freedom to go against his own being, which his being is his freedom. Like that's what St. Thomas, I think, would reply to that.
Yeah, and our freedom, and I think that's another way in which like this privational state of things, like a privation is a degree, a mode of something that exists substantially. So like negative freedom can only participate within positive freedom. Like the rational intellect and will of the human person is an image of God. So in rejecting that, you're still nonetheless bound to, in a way, the image of God. So it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum. You're constantly caught in this loop, in this paradoxical loop, in which through negation, you're constantly have to negate the negation. And actually, Meister Eckhart, I found in this research, is the one who invented the term the negation of the negation. So according to that logic, where the negation of the negation is where the nothingness is reclaimed as a positive and divine attribute. Negative freedom is recast as the primordial condition of the divine and an undirected will of pure potency. And negative freedom against natural law and natural theology, negating the creature is paradoxically the creature is ready to his uncreated condition as one with the creator in the abyss of the soul. And Eckhart continuously refers to this as the little spark or the kernel, even, the same language that the Kabbalists use to talk about the shell and the fruit, the kernel, spark, that's then taken up within the Tikkun Olam imagery. So to move this a little bit closer to the idea of the humiliation ritual. Well, first of all, there's a story recounted about the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. As a loyalty test, he would bring out his courtiers into a pasture field. The emperor would point at a cow and say, "That's a goat." He would then ask the courtier what animal they saw. If they answered with anything other than "that's a goat," they would then be killed immediately. So the devil desires his own form of penance in the form of a humiliation ritual. Nicholas of Cusa's learned ignorance, or docta ignorantia, is not simply knowing what you do not know. It is a method of approaching God grounded in the insight that finite reason collapses at the point where opposites coincide. So for Cusa, he claims being and not being are not opposed, but are unified in an identity that surpasses contradiction. In God, contraries are not contrary. In the infinite, the maximum and the minimum coincide. Therefore, the opposites, good and evil, large and small, are one. See how he's kind of couching these privational dichotomies with with true dialectical coincidences. It says, it is proper to say that in God there is a coincidence of maximum and minimum, as I've said. But Cusa, however, allows the privations to serve as opposite, good and evil, being and non-being, when in fact privations are merely modes or degrees of being. So this brings us to a distinction I want to make. It's kind of an overlapping distinction. In Pseudo-Dionysus, he has this concept of agnosia, which is the limit of knowledge before divine transcendence. Learned ignorance is knowing the structure of one's not knowing. It's like an epistemology. It's like being able to claim as a method this act of not knowing in order to reach God. It instrumentalizes it. So agnosia is a limit concept where negation protects divine transcendence. Learned ignorance is an epistemology. Negation reveals a new positive way to identify with God. So Cusa splits knowledge into a twofold doctrine of light: the lumen inferius, light of reason, and the lumen superius. Only by the higher light can the intellect be raised to see what it does not see, that is, to know its ignorance as learned. The vision of God occurs not in the light of the creature, but in the light in which God sees himself. So again, collapsing that distinction in which you gain a God's eye view by deconstructing and decreating all that's knowable. In their system, God creates the world through a humiliation ritual of renouncing himself and clearing a space for absolute freedom in this Ungara.
So that's just a really important point there. Then, if the ritual humiliation is being carried out by the synagogue against formerly Christian nations, they are ultimately taking as their model for the ritual humiliation of the Godhead himself in their Kabbalistic belief, which is the Simsum.
Yes, and then it sets up this processing, and I think that's the Simsum has to be sort of thought through as like there's the creator creature distinction. This is what I was talking about earlier about this Gnosticism thesis that we hear so much about, is that there's two sides of it. There's two different ways in which the error can appear, and we have to be kind of on guard from both, because as we saw, like the influence of Kabbalah can at once be materialist, and it can the next minute be Gnostic and anti-matter, if we're defining Gnosticism that way. And And so likewise, the paradox that's built into this process of epistemological unknowing is as a way of humiliating the subject down to its lowest point, at which point it deifies itself and enters into union with Christ or with the Godhead. Then it's a kind of the paradox of liberalism, in which as Aristotle says, it's a cutout for oligarchy, or it's a cutout for a future tyranny, in which or the tyranny of the, as de Tocqueville says, the tyranny of the majority. So a point I want to come to with this German mystical stream is, first off, the more subtle the form of magic, the more efficacious it is. And part of what the humiliation ritual elicits is a participatory metaphysics, in which we're participating in a kind of economy through subjecting ourselves to a power and honoring something. But there's a paradox in this mystical stream, in which denying oneself, disciplining oneself, and humiliating oneself, we come out on the other end equal to God. And I think that's a paradox that's built into liberalism. And another point I want to say is, like, there's two participatory economies at work here, metaphysical economies. And one is constantly trying to collapse, assault, and confuse this gap between the creator and creature, and make it appear as something that can be overcome epistemologically, or through magic, or through some form of gnosis. When it's always going to fail, it's always going to come up short, and it's always going to be left into a greater state of confusion. So the only hope we can have is a kind of hope in numbers, and drawing more minds and souls into its mystical orbit. But the two economies, they're two participatory economies. One happens to be autonomous and the other isn't. And I think that's an important point we need to remind ourselves of as an advantage in spiritual warfare.
The primacy of grace, the gratuity of the true salvific economy, that through God's overflowing goodness, he wills us to participate in his own divine life, which is a principle that the devil can never understand. The devil can never understand pure gift. Everything is grasped. And that's, of course, what he tempted our first parents to do. There's the solution, is really just allowing God to solve it and participating in that. I'd like to return to the phenomenon of mass immigration. I've got a few more thoughts here, particularly how it relates to borders at different levels of human society. So, as Aristotle points out, mass immigration is useful to the plutocratic oligarchies that continue to subjugate and parasitize the people. And there is a connection, there's a deep connection between immigration and ritual humiliation. Just in this country, you had the Brexit vote, in which a majority, a slim majority, but a majority, voted in favor of leaving the European Union, which is a proto-globalist supranational union. And that was really driven by anxiety about replacement level immigration. And then, interestingly, it got delayed and frustrated over many years. But eventually, Boris Johnson, who had been the leader of the Brexit campaign, was elected prime minister in a landslide victory on the manifesto of getting Brexit done. That was in 2019. Of course, COVID then followed, and that fake crisis was then used as a smokescreen for the biggest wave of mass immigration that this country has ever seen. This is the so-called Boris wave, and this was even more even more destabilizing than previous levels of immigration, which had largely been from European countries, so from countries with a shared Christian cultural background. This was largely from the third world. And so I think this was an intentional ritual humiliation of the British people, that the very man who had led the Brexit campaign was the Prime Minister who enacted the Boris wave. Of course, the factors that Aristotle alludes to, that you have your own fatherland taken over by foreign men, is deeply humiliating. And I'd like to relate this then to spirited men, which is how Aristotle describes them, and how that is attacked by the power structure. There was a very good comment, I think it was a comment on one of my videos, which I'm going to quote now. I'm afraid I can't remember. I didn't write down the commenter themselves. So if I do cite you, then please do comment below, and I'll be able to properly attribute this excellent quote. They said, quote, "The psyche of a people depends on relations between the sexes. If young men are forced to accept that the woman they pursue, the women or woman they pursue have been seen by legions of others, and they might continue to be so seen, a man's pride is broken from his youth. He is robbed of his spiritual function, the instinct to guard particularity, to cultivate the health of a body distinct from other bodies, the love of character, household, identity, and borders, upon which all harmony and grander unity must be based. If a woman is not a wife, not exclusive to him, to his eyes, a young man is thwarted from the righteous sense of possession on which civilization is based." End quote. So I thought that was a very good articulation of what's going on here, that the attack on private property, it extends to the attack on manhood, in which one of the fulfillments of being a man is to have a wife who is monogamous with you, and you are her head as she is your heart. You are one flesh, and ideally she is a virgin when you're married, and there's that is prized. So the notion that your woman has been shared around, even seen by lots of other men, is inherently humiliating. And that, of course, is something that the Judeo-Masonic culture has encouraged to a gigantic degree. It corresponds to the borders of the nation being eroded. So there is accordingly no exclusivity, no home, no border, no trench from which to resist the oligarchy. This corresponds to the killing of the king ritual, as we've seen. The overthrow of kings themselves, Christian monarchs, then the degradation of fathers as kings of their families. And then finally, and I think this is what you're referring to closely there, Mr. Tucker, was the dethroning of reason as king of the soul. That the rejection of the natural order of things, which it creates this disintegrated soul, which is then prey to the ritual humiliation. It gets even darker. For Satan to make the bride, as in the church, the human family, his own, means sharing her as widely as possible. There's the kind of adultery, which is frequently invoked in Holy Writ, the adultery of the people of Israel. This is what Satan wants to do, and you see that with the conciliar ecumenism and interreligious heresies, this kind of promiscuity of the church, or that's the way they're trying to do it, as the most tragic humiliation ritual of all.
It's as though there were these medieval prelates who wrote these manuals on, like during the Inquisition, on black masses and the practices of like witches' Sabbaths, and they talked about like these inversions of the sacraments. It's almost as if like the entire social order is being constructed into a giant black mass, with the the inversion of the marital sacrament and the penitential sacrament and the sacrament of authority, and we could go on if we wanted to read it in a linear sort of way. But yeah, that's a really profound thought about the giving over particularity when one's sense of protection for their their wife has been so corrupted in that way, and how that extends out to, protecting the particularity of a nation or of a social group.
We've talked before about Vicente Evangelista's notion of the pornography of indignation, the sort of cheap alarmism that fills much of the media space, including the alternative media space. How it's based on this sort of voyeurism, this kind of rubbernecking of the end of your civilization. He writes, quote, "It serves as a tool for the media, both regime and alternative, for a certain type of pornography of indignation, which by inciting irascible appetite, public indignation, encourages serious political polarization and the feeling of anarchy. The idea is introduced that the decomposition of society is being televised and no one can do anything to change it. Situations like this only transmit hopelessness and exasperate an already frustrated population. It is necessary to point out the problems and propose solutions without falling into cheap alarmism." End quote. So I think that's maybe a message of hope that I would offer as one of my final comments, is that there is not inevitability to the ritual humiliation, that the solutions exist to not be ritually humiliated, which of course is the teaching of Christ's church that he established on earth, and the participation in her sacraments.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think a point I was trying to make earlier, the idea of the assault of the rational soul, rationality, like the irrational, requires the rational, just as non-being requires being, and evil requires the good because it's only a relative property. Like I was saying with the negative freedom, it requires the imago Dei for there to be a negative freedom in the first place.
Mm.
So I think one of the ways in which we're caught with our guards down is thinking that this is like that the simulacrum is possible. Ultimately, the simulacrum can't become its own autonomous, just like this process of reuniting with divine nothingness can never be achieved. So it has to be sort of reframed over and over again, and in a more precise way, and in different social milieus and formats. I think there's some hope in knowing that like reality can't be replaced, reality can't be fully overcome, because it's guaranteed within God, who's constantly creating it. So yeah, from that sense, it's purely psychological. It's in the realm of perception, and so guarding our perceptions, I think, is a battlefield that's underexplored.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Mr. Tucker. And here, classical wisdom underlines exactly what you've said, that God is goodness itself. That's a transcendental of being. And that here's the communication of idioms. Aristotle says that the worst enemy to the tyrant is the good man. So if we don't want to be humiliated, then we need to become good. We need to participate in God's goodness, which he has made uniquely possible for us through his own body and blood and his sacraments, his other sacraments. And through being good men, we become free men, because the truth sets us free.
Right. It's the battle of two participatory economies, two cities.
That's a profound thought. Yes. Yes, that the Antichrist economy is also participatory in its parasitic way.
Right.
The devil is simia Dei, is the ape of God. There is that system. Well, Mr. Tucker, I have found our conversation to be as interesting and insightful as ever. I highly recommend to our viewers your latest series on Eric Prajvara and the Analogia Entis itself, and the way that it's been attacked and denatured, because I think it really is the root of theological modernism and the the false ontology which is behind the ritual humiliation. Thank you very much for your time and your great scholarship.
Always a pleasure. Thanks very much, Theo. God bless you.
Viva Cristo Rey.